Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today's event is hosted by the Solpry School of Public Policy, as well as by the Behavioral Science Society, which is a student and a society for students and postdocs at USC who are interested in behavioral science. And they are affiliated with the Behavioral Science and Wellbeing Policy Initiative, which I lead with other faculty at USC. And we're funded by the USC Research Office. So today's event is led by Maryann Samson, and she is a member of the USC Behavioral Science Society Executive Board organized and is hosting this event. She recently received her master's in social work from USC and graduated summa cum laude. Before this, she graduated from Endicott College with a bachelor degree in psychology, also summa cum laude. And she will be starting a PhD in social psychology at Portland State University in the fall of 2021, focused on health habits and social relationships. Thank you for hosting this event, Maryann. The floor is yours.
Thank you. The purpose of this writing competition was to inspire interdisciplinary discussions and the sharing of knowledge between fields. USC is known for having exceptional student research, and behavioral science is one of the key fields in which USC is a world leader. The prize for this writing competition was $100 and the opportunity to present today. This meeting will be videotaped and professionally edited. This recording will be available on the Behavioral Science Society website. So I'm going to post a link to that website right now, where the recording will be posted. All the papers that were submitted were outstanding. Of all the papers, the top 2 will be presented today. The judges could not agree on which paper was the overall best, so decided to submit both. The names of our 2 winners for the 2021 Behavioral Science Society Writing Competition are Dr. David Newman and Mariel Bello. So our first presenter will be Dr. David Newman. He'll be presenting his paper, Contrasting Effects of Finding Meaning and Searching for Meaning in Life on Feelings and Behaviors during the COVID-19 pandemic. He has a PhD in social psychology from USC. He is now a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. David, too, notably, was a recipient of the 2021 International Positive Psychology Association Top Dissertation Award. So David will now go ahead and go through his presentation.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for this award. I feel really grateful to you guys and excited to share some of my research with you. So let me go ahead and share my slides with you. So I'm currently a postdoc at UCSF, but I received my PhD in social psychology at USC. After completing my PhD, I completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Self-Report Science, where I worked with Arthur Stone. And this is a project that I worked on during my time as a postdoc with Arthur Stone and also with Stefan Schneider, who's also at USC. So I'll begin by talking a bit about Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was one of the most well-known Holocaust survivors, in large part because of his seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in this book, he said that those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. He came up with this idea after he witnessed that during his time in the concentration camps, where he noticed that people who had a sense of meaning or purpose in life were more likely to survive than those who did not have that sense of meaning and purpose. Later in his book, he also said that the search for meaning is a fundamental human motivation and something that we should try to engage in. The research in psychology has tried to distinguish the presence of meaning in life and the search for meaning in life. Presence of meaning in life is often assessed with questions that ask people the extent to which they understand their life's meaning, whereas searching for meaning in life is often assessed with questions about the extent to which people are seeking a purpose or mission for their life. These variables are often measured as individual differences. That is, some people might find more meaning in life than others, and likewise, some people might be searching for meaning in life to a greater extent than others. So far, the research has shown that the presence of meaning in life relates positively to well-being, health, and longevity. So these are people who tend to be happy, they tend to live longer, they tend to be healthy. Whereas searching for meaning in life tends to relate negatively to well-being. These are people who are not so happy. Research has also shown that people who search for meaning in life are also likely to self-sacrifice. They try to engage in heroism activities. They tend to report high levels of sensation seeking. I thought these two variables would be particularly relevant to study during the COVID-19 pandemic because meaning provides a framework to make sense of life's tragedies and uncertainties. They also relate to the big questions that people might face. For example, why might one neighbor live while another one dies? It's also important to consider the roles of politics and religion, topics that people say that you shouldn't really discuss with your in-laws, but make for fascinating topics to study. And I think that they're particularly important to study during the COVID-19 pandemic. Religion can offer a sense of meaning in life, and it also offers an avenue to search for meaning. We've also seen that conservatives tend to report more meaning in life than liberals. And these variables are also particularly important for the COVID-19 pandemic. You've probably seen a bunch of headlines about conservatives and religious people who have decided not to wear face masks or not to engage in social distancing behaviors. And so I thought these were particularly relevant to study. So the primary goal of the study was to look and see how presence of meaning in life and searching for meaning in life would predict three different outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I looked at people's negative feelings, their preventative health behaviors, such as wearing face masks and social distancing, as well as some risky health behaviors, such as attending large gatherings. So I was interested in how these variables would predict these outcomes. And as a secondary goal, I also looked at how religiosity and political orientation would predict these same outcome variables. So to do so, I analyzed data from the Understanding America study. This is a study that has been put together by the Center for Economic and Social Research at USC. This is a large panel study where participants are asked to complete various different questions. And this is a study that has been going on for several years. And at the onset of the pandemic, the researchers decided to send out questionnaires to participants at different times during the pandemic and ask them some questions about their experiences. So I was able to analyze data from a US nationally representative sample. Participants were financially compensated and the response rates were pretty high. And I was able to analyze data from just over 7,000 participants. So participants completed questions about political orientation and religiosity, as well as questions about their presence and search for meaning in life prior to the onset of the pandemic. And then in early March till early May, they completed some questions about their negative feelings, their preventative health behaviors, and some risky health behaviors. And for some context, California issued the first stay-at-home order at the end of March, and the CDC recommended wearing face masks in early April. So here's some of the results. I've looked at the slopes at 3 different time points. And what you can see here on the x-axis is the question, my life has a clear sense of purpose or meaning, and people who are on the far right side tend to find more meaning in life than people on the left side. And you can see that people who find meaning report lower levels of negative feelings, lower levels of sadness and stress and worry. We find the exact opposite pattern for people who are searching for meaning in life. Again, people on the far right side are people who tend to search more for meaning in life than people on the left side. And we see that people who are searching for meaning in life actually report higher levels of stress and sadness and so forth. In terms of their preventative health behaviors, such as social distancing and so forth, we find that people who find more meaning in life are more likely to engage in some of these preventative health behaviors. And to help you visualize and make sense of this a little bit more, we see that people on the right side, people who find more meaning in life, are actually more likely to cancel social plans at the beginning of the pandemic compared to people who don't find as much meaning in their lives. We find the same pattern for people who search for meaning in life. So people who search for meaning in their lives are more likely to engage in some of these preventative health behaviors. Here's another example. People who are searching for meaning in their lives are actually more likely to cancel their travel plans. People who find meaning in life were less likely to engage in some of the risky health behaviors. Whereas in contrast, people who search for meaning in life were actually more likely to engage in some of these risky health behaviors. So at this point, I'm just going to take a quick pause and provide a summary of the findings in a more visual or pictorial sense. We see that people who tend to find meaning in their lives report lower levels of negative feelings. They report higher levels of preventative health behaviors and lower levels of risky health behaviors. And the green thumbs up indicates that they're essentially doing what the CDC has recommended, things that are helpful in preventing the spread of the coronavirus. Whereas people who search for meaning in life, they tend to report higher levels of negative feelings. They engage in some preventative health behaviors, but they're also more likely to engage in some risky health behaviors. So in terms of their behaviors that are beneficial for other people, there's sort of this mixed finding. So next we'll look at religiosity and political orientation. We find that religious people were actually less stressed and depressed than less religious people. This essentially replicates some previous findings. And likewise, we see that conservatives were less stressed and depressed than liberals. We found that religious people were more likely to engage in some preventive healthy behaviors compared to people who were less religious. So here's an example of the highly religious people would be on the right side here as well. And we see that they're more likely to cancel or postpone their air travel during the onset of the pandemic compared to people who are less religious. We also find that the conservatives were less likely to engage in some preventive health behaviors. Here's an example of people who wore face masks. You've probably seen some of these results in the news, and this essentially replicates what you've probably seen before. This finding shows that conservatives are less likely to wear face masks than liberals, and this is a pretty striking difference. We also found that religious people were more likely to engage in some health behaviors than the less religious people. Conservatives were more likely to engage in some of these risky health behaviors compared to liberals. So to summarize these latter two findings, we find that religious people reported lower levels of negative feelings compared to less religious people. They were more likely to engage in some preventative health behaviors, but they were also more likely to engage in some risky health behaviors. So these latter findings here tend to look pretty similar to people who are searching for meaning in life. In terms of their behaviors that are beneficial for others in society, there's sort of this mixed effect. We find that conservatives were less stressed and sad compared to liberals, but we see that conservatives were less likely to engage in preventive health behaviors and more likely to engage in risky health behaviors. So they essentially were not doing any of the things that the CDC was recommending. So I wanted to close just by highlighting a particular policy implication. And that's the finding about meaning in life. We found that meaning in life was not only associated with subjective reports of an individual's well-being, but it also relates to the health of the individual and contributes to the health of others in society. So much of the research on meaning in life has shown that meaning in life is particularly beneficial for the individual. It helps these people become happy and healthy, they live longer and so forth. But there's been very little research looking at how a sense of meaning in life may be beneficial for others in society. And so this is research that shows that having a sense of meaning or purpose can be beneficial to other people. And so therefore, I believe that it would be beneficial for society, for public policymakers to consider people's sense of meaning and purpose in life, in addition to other well-being indicators, such as life satisfaction or people's emotions, because these results do show that people's sense of meaning and purpose can influence their behaviors. So if you're interested in some more of this research, this paper was recently accepted at the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. And there's a link here to my website. If you're interested in reading this, I'll try to post a link to the paper pretty soon. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for your attention. And I think at this time, I'm able to take some questions.
Thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. That's just a very interesting topic. And yeah, obviously very timely. So I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So yeah, go ahead and say that in the chat. And I will be able to, or in the Q&A, and I'll be able to read them. So we have one question here. So for the first question, so the political aspect is interesting to see. What are some co-founders you consider in this case? For example, the influence of media content people are exposed to and age groups.
Yeah, there's an excellent question. And I should have mentioned in all of these analyses, I controlled for some of the basic demographics like age, gender, education, and so forth. So what this means is that particularly for the political orientation findings, we find that conservatives, after controlling for some of these other demographics, so if we had, say, a sample of just older adults, we'd still find that among the older adults, conservatives were less stressed and depressed and so forth, and they were less likely to engage in some of these behaviors compared to liberals. The question about media exposure is really interesting, and it's one that we did not consider in these analyses. So it could be the case that certainly conservatives and liberals might be obtaining their news from different sources. They might be receiving recommendations from different sources, and so that could certainly play a factor in these behaviors.
That's really interesting. So we have another question here. So it seems that one of the main takeaways from your paper is how meeting individuals can be helpful for society's health. So what kinds of interventions, you kind of mentioned at the end, but what kind of interventions specifically could policymakers implement to improve people's meaning in life?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good point. So there's been some research that looks at meaning in life and different types of interventions and different types of experiments that can promote people's sense of meaning in life. Some of the research has shown that social relationships is one of the key factors. So having a good sense of social support, a social network, people who can make you feel connected and part of something bigger than yourself can really provide you with a sense of meaning in life. Another factor is a sense of like a worldview. This is some kind of worldview that helps you make sense of everything, helps you integrate what's going on in daily life with the larger story. So this is, I think, part of the reason we see that religious people tend to find more meaning in life than less religious people. They have this coherent framework or narrative. It doesn't have to be necessarily a religious worldview, but any type of broad framework or sense that things fit together is really important. And then there's some recent research that's been pretty interesting that has highlighted that there's a bunch of different mundane daily activities that can actually provide people with a sense of meaning in life. Like simply positive mood can improve your sense of meaning in life. And having a daily routine, doing the same thing over and over, actually improves people's sense of meaning in life. It gives them the sense that things are connected. Yeah, so and any kind of things that happen in daily life that give you the sense that things are coherent, things are connected, can also provide people with a sense of meaning in life. So those are a few of the types of things that people could do to improve their sense of meaning in life.
That's really interesting. So yeah, it sounds like a couple of different things. Yeah, another question is, are you going to do any follow-up work on this very important topic?
You know, I've been thinking about it there. So the Understanding America study is an excellent data set, and they continue to ask participants and track people with different questions about their experiences during the pandemic. And you know, the data that I analyzed were from early on in the pandemic, and I do think it would be interesting to look at how people's sense of meaning and purpose in life also influences their desire to get vaccinated, their political engagement in other types of things, their voting behavior and so forth. So those are some questions that I would be interested in doing at some point in the future. Yeah, so and more broadly, I'm quite interested in people's sense of meaning and purpose in life, and I'm working on some studies about how meaning relates to different types of emotional experiences, like how nostalgic people feel. Yeah, so that's been some of my ongoing research.
That's really interesting about, yeah, it's like meaning and like nostalgia. And yeah, that's really interesting. And that's something you might look into in the future. Another question was that, so you found that, you know, with like COVID specifically, that there was different amounts of health protective behaviors between liberals and conservatives. Is this same trend true with other sort of health protective behaviors, maybe like exercise or certain types of diet or restraining from substances or other health behaviors?
That's a good question. So I actually know a little bit more about some of the research with religiosity, which is also correlated with political orientation. And the research has shown that in terms of some of these health behaviors, religious people tend to engage in some, or they tend to refrain from some unhealthy behaviors related to alcohol and substance use. And so they tend to be healthier in some ways, but they also then tend to go to the doctors less often, and they might have some other illnesses that can go untreated, or they so there's sort of this mixed finding in terms of people's sense of religious beliefs and their healthy behaviors and so forth. And I think that likely has to do sort of with their framework and the way they view the world in terms of feeling as if everything's sort of connected and part of a larger plan. And so I think some of those findings I just mentioned also do relate to political orientation because they tend to be correlated, but I don't know about any specific data on that.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Would any part of, it's kind of just like a little question, but would any part of it maybe like living in more rural areas versus like access to healthcare? Do you think that's any part of like a physical place, or do you think it's kind of more about ideology, like these differences with going to the doctor, or health protective behaviors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I would imagine it's probably a little bit of both. I think the sort of the social ecology, where people live certainly influences their behaviors, their access to healthcare and so forth. Those are real influences. But I do think then their ideology and their beliefs probably also have a role as well.
So we have another question came in that says, assuming that you were surveying participants about their religiosity and meaning in life in the same survey, do you think participants who identify as religious might be primed to respond as having a high meaning or purpose in life, as religion typically presupposes a sense of greater purpose? That's a really good question.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think that it certainly is the case, and that's been a concern in some of the research on religious experiences and well-being, is that if you ask somebody about their religious beliefs, it certainly primes them to think about, oh yes, I do have this larger framework and life makes sense and so forth. In our particular study, we were fortunate in the sense that the questions about religion were not asked right at the same time as meaning in life. So those are actually asked prior. And I believe that in previous research, there has been enough studies that have separated these two variables in such a way that the religiosity concepts are not primed when they think about meaning in life. However, there have been some people who've been concerned with some of these questions about meaning in life, that the questions themselves might prime a sense of religiosity. And so that has been one concern that researchers have thought about.
So this is kind of, probably be one of the last questions, and we touched on it a little bit, but do you see any regional variation in answers? And when considering religion, did you note any difference between different religions?
Do we notice any differences between the different religions and different?
So I think I had two different questions.
The first one is like, about geographic.
It appears it's two different questions. The first one was like two different questions in the same little box. Yeah. It says, do you see any regional variation in answers? I guess starting with that.
That's a good question. I think I looked at that at one point, and so there certainly are regional differences in some of these COVID-19 behavior, risky and preventative health behaviors. I don't believe that we saw that made a difference, in the sense that I believe we did control for whether they lived in a rural area or an urban area. And I believe that meaning in life still predicted these behaviors, even controlling for that. But I did not look at some of the specific differences in meaning in life across these different regions. I think that would be interesting to look at. And then in terms of the different religions, I did not look at that specifically to see if there were some people of a particular religious background engaging in certain behaviors more so than others. It's just, I simply did not look at that. And this is a nationally representative US sample. Most of the religious participants are Christian or belong to some sort of denomination of Christianity. And so I did not look at some of the other religions, but that would be an interesting thing to look at.
That would be interesting. It's hard to look at everything in one study. So that completely makes sense. So we're gonna have to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to say that we have not addressed yet?
Oh, I think these were sort of the key takeaways. I guess the one final piece that I might mention is that there was an interesting analysis that looked at people's preventative health behaviors and their negative feelings at a within-person level. We find that people are more stressed and sad and anxious whenever they engage in more preventative health behaviors. That suggests that engaging in some of these things kind of brings to mind the dangers of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's interesting that people who find meaning in their lives were more likely to engage in these behaviors, even though it may have some sort of cost on their emotional well-being. So that was one last finding that I thought I would leave you with, that I thought was kind of interesting. And so I think it highlights sort of this emphasis of the importance of finding meaning and purpose in your life.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, David.
Oh, so I'll go ahead. Thanks for having me. Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. So going on to our next presenter, Mariel Bello will now present her paper, Association of Frequency of Perceived Exposure to Discrimination with Tobacco Withdrawal Symptoms and Smoking Lapse Behavior in African Americans. She's a doctoral candidate in the USC Clinical Science Program and a National Science Foundation pre-doctoral fellow. She received her BS in psychology summa cum laude at USC.
Thank you so much, Maryann, for that really sweet introduction. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Everything looks good? All right, hello everyone. So my name is Mariel Bello. I'm a clinical psychologist in training and addiction scientist in the clinical science PhD program at the University of Southern California. So I'm incredibly humbled and honored to receive this award, and I'm incredibly excited to present a paper that I'm very proud of that's entitled The Association of Frequency of Perceived Exposure to Discrimination with Tobacco Withdrawal Symptoms in African Americans. So before we begin, I just wanted to note that none of our authors reported a conflict of interest, and these are our funding agencies. So despite the substantial decline in current cigarette smoking rates in the US over the past decade, racial ethnic disparities in tobacco addiction continue to be well documented in the literature. So as you can see here from this figure that illustrates quit smoking rates in the US from 1965 to 2015, quit smoking rates have been substantially increasing over time, which is a good thing. However, the rates of successful smoking cessation remain persistently lower among African Americans relative to other racial ethnic groups, as you can see here, Latinx populations and whites. And so several studies have demonstrated that African Americans continue to experience a disproportionate burden of tobacco-related morbidity and mortality in the United States. They're also less likely to successfully quit smoking, and also are more risk for relapse following a cessation attempt relative to other racial ethnic groups, despite being very highly motivated to quit smoking. And so recent laboratory work has shown that potentially African Americans relative to other racial ethnic groups might experience more extensive mood disturbance and severe tobacco withdrawal during smoking cessation attempts. And this might partially explain why there might be lower rates of successful smoking cessation in African Americans than whites and Latinx populations. Therefore, more research is really needed to investigate the potential mechanisms that underlie tobacco withdrawal symptoms and poorer cessation success in African American smokers in order to better understand what the potential sources of these smoking-related health disparities are, also to inform tailored smoking cessation treatment approaches for ethnic minority groups, and to ultimately reduce the public health burden of smoking in minority populations. So one sociocultural stressor that has been shown to impede the decline of smoking prevalence and also interfere with quit smoking attempts among racial ethnic minority groups is discrimination. And so how we can define discrimination is unequal or unfair treatment by individuals and or other social institutions on the basis of gender, race, ethnic or national origin, sexual orientation, social class, or other factors. And so prior work has suggested that discrimination is disproportionately represented and experienced by African Americans and also predicts greater risk of relapse during cessation attempts. And so African Americans, smokers who experience greater discrimination have shown to be at greater risk of being a smoker, have higher tobacco dependence severity, and also greater motivation to smoke to improve mood and cognition. However, the mechanisms through which discrimination may undermine efforts to quit smoking and also the effect of the quality of life in African Americans is currently unknown. And so this is what our study kind of aimed to do, is we were really interested in trying to explore the impact of discrimination on smoking. And more specifically, we were examining whether self-reported frequency of discriminatory experiences in one's daily life predicted tobacco withdrawal outcomes that are known to be strong determinants of failed quit attempts and core drivers of tobacco addiction. So the outcomes that we focused on in this study were urges and cravings to smoke, mood states, and subjective cognitive functioning. And so our sample also was specifically African American smokers. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only focusing on the outcomes with the strongest association with self-reported discrimination, just due to time restrictions. However, I just wanted to note that we also explored several other tobacco withdrawal outcomes that are also detailed within the publication. So if you're interested, please email me. I'm happy to share my publication with you. So this study is a secondary analysis of data from the Southern California Tobacco Addiction Phenotype Project, which is a completed study that investigated individual differences in the expression of withdrawal among African American smokers. And so our sample was 607 non-treatment seeking African American smokers recruited from the greater metropolitan Los Angeles area. And so you can see here the demographics and smoking history characteristics of our sample. About 40% of our sample is female, average age of about 50 years old. Participants smoke roughly about 15 cigarettes per day. And then majority of our sample earn an income of less than $15,000 per year, which indicates significant socioeconomic disadvantage within our sample. And then on average, our sample was moderate to heavy smokers with medium levels of nicotine dependence. So participants first completed a baseline session where they came in, they completed informed consent, breath alcohol and carbon monoxide level analysis just to determine smoking status, followed by the completion of demographic and smoking history questionnaires and other self-report measures. And so following that initial baseline session, participants were then assigned to one of two groups where smoking absence was manipulated. So these are the session timelines you can see here for group 1 and for group 2. And so for the abstinent condition, participants were instructed to not smoke after 8 p.m. the night before their session. And this was to simulate 16 hours of tobacco abstinence, to simulate a quit smoking attempt, because their experimental session would start at 12 p.m. the next day. And so the other would be the non-abstinent condition. And in the non-abstinent condition, participants were instructed to smoke as normally as they would. And then when they arrived for their session, they were required to smoke one cigarette of their preferred brand, just to standardize for smoking recency at the beginning of the session. So these two groups were designed to ensure that experimental sessions were counterbalanced, just in order to account for order effects for sessions. And so we verified 16 hours of tobacco abstinence by carbon monoxide levels of 9 parts per million or below, using a carbon monoxide monitor, which is a gold standard in the literature. And so in order to assess for self-reported frequency of discrimination, we use the Everyday Discrimination Scale. This is a well-validated 9-item measure that was administered only at baseline, and it assessed self-reported frequency of day-to-day experiences of interpersonal discrimination in one's daily life. So each item captured an exemplary type of discrimination experience, as you can see here, like treated with less courtesy than others, you're threatened and harassed. And then participants were asked to rate the frequency of this discrimination experience on 6-point Likert scales, from 0 being never to, you can see here, 5 being almost every day. And so we used the total score, which was based on the sum ratings across the 9 items, with higher scores indicating a higher frequency of self-reported discriminatory experiences. And then, so to assess tobacco withdrawal outcomes during experimental sessions and the changes in tobacco withdrawal outcomes, we use the following measures. So for smoking urges and cravings to smoke, we use a 10-item brief questionnaire of smoking urges, which is comprised of 2 different factors that assess the intention and urge to smoke for pleasure and the desire to smoke to alleviate negative mood states experienced right now. We also used the 72-item profile of mood states to assess changes in negative mood states. So this involved rating negative mood adjectives as experienced right now on the Likert scale of 0, not at all, 4, extremely. And so we computed 5 negative mood subscales, which you can see here, based on the mean responses across items for each subscale. So then to measure tobacco withdrawal symptoms, we use the 28-item Wisconsin Smoking Withdrawal Scale, which is a multidimensional measure that assesses severity of tobacco withdrawal symptoms. And this included 6 subscales, as you can see here, based on mean responses across items. And then lastly, we assessed individual differences in state impulsive tendencies by using the current impulsivity scale, which instructed participants to rate a set of statements based on how they felt right now. So for our analytical approach, we conducted separate linear regression models to examine the association of baseline self-reported discrimination with deprivation-induced change scores in each experimental outcome. So how can we calculate change scores is we just subtracted scores from the abstinent condition with scores from the non-abstinent condition to create a tobacco withdrawal outcome and the change in those outcomes. So the next several figures I'll be showing will display the standardized beta estimates that indicate the strength of associations between self-reported discrimination with each respective tobacco withdrawal outcome. And so standardized beta estimates can range from 0 to 1, with higher estimates suggesting stronger associations. So estimates above 0 indicate positive associations, and estimates below 0 indicate negative associations. And so additionally, any bar with an asterisk on top indicates a statistically significant association. So in this figure, what we found is that greater levels of self-reported frequency of discriminatory experiences were positively associated with greater abstinent-induced increases in urges and cravings to smoke to specifically relieve negative mood states during tobacco withdrawal. And then we also found significant associations between higher levels of reported discrimination with greater abstinence-induced exacerbations in several negative mood states during tobacco withdrawal, specifically anger, anxiety, depression, and an overall negative mood composite. And then lastly, we found positive associations between self-reported frequency of discrimination and then the confusion measure of subjective cognitive functioning during withdrawal. So as I mentioned, we also explored other tobacco withdrawal outcomes and also found several non-significant associations, which are detailed in the paper. And so in summary, we found some preliminary evidence to suggest that sociocultural stressors, such as self-reported frequency of discriminatory experiences in one's daily life, may exacerbate specific tobacco withdrawal symptoms, specifically potentially in minority groups such as African American smokers. And so some implications for our work is that potentially tailoring smoking cessation interventions to include the assessment of discrimination might benefit clinicians and also inform the treatment of tobacco withdrawal, especially among African Americans who experience high rates of discrimination. And then lastly, some implications for our findings too is that future work might provide a scientific agenda for health equity promotion in vulnerable groups by suggesting for us, we as researchers, continue to explore not only individual level factors like psychological factors or biological factors, but also additionally, we also should include the assessment of sociocultural determinants such as discrimination that may contribute to pervasive disparities facing African Americans. So I just wanted to thank my advisor, Dr. Adam Leventhal, my mentors, my colleagues, and the USC HEAL research team. They're my academic family. And then thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions, and please feel free to reach out to me for this paper if you are interested. I'm happy to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an interesting topic, and the perfect blend with the biopsychosocial factors on, such an important issue. That was an amazing presentation. We'll go ahead and open up to questions, give the audience a second to write some. Okay, so our first question is, thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to know if you considered A, the considerably more prominent marketing of tobacco products in neighborhoods having a higher number of African American families, and B, age at which the participants first start smoking, which might impact their ability to quit smoking. So we can go ahead and let you answer A first, because I know sometimes it's hard hearing all at the same time. But so first of all, just asking about, some they're asking about, the specific marketing of tobacco products in certain neighborhoods.
That's an excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
So for the purposes of this study, we really focused on biopsychosocial factors that are impacting, specifically also genetic factors implicated in tobacco withdrawal symptoms in African American groups. But that specific question you have about marketing is this whole separate field, especially within the public health field, that is so problematic. I mean, there's lots of literature showing that, menthol cigarette smoking and menthol cigarettes are particularly targeting African American communities and other disadvantaged communities as well in terms of those communities. But specifically in this paper, we did not assess for that, just because in our other studies, which are our field studies where we go out and assess in the communities, we are addressing those types of questions. So that is a great point. Maybe more papers in the future, but a lot of people are doing great work like that. And I think now with the recent proposals to ban menthol cigarettes by the FDA and other flavored tobacco products will address those problematic issues where vulnerable groups are being targeted by tobacco companies and other products as well. And then in terms of the second point, so what we did is we had, for our revisions too, we ran several different types of analysis with different types of covariates, age at onset for smoking. When you first started smoking, we did a control, and our association still remains significant. So that is something that we did include into our analyses, and it still remains significant. So great question.
That was really, it was a great question and great answer. Another question that comes up is that your paper provided very important information about issues related to discrimination. What types of interventions or treatments do you recommend for minority smokers who are experiencing discrimination?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why I became a researcher is because I wanted to become an advocate for underserved communities. And so ideally what we would want to do is implement policies and interventions to targets and to address and to change systemic racism as a society. Unfortunately, that's going to be a very long time before we do that. So there are some research suggesting that there are potentially hardiness and resiliency interventions where we can teach patients who experience high rates of discrimination and who also use substances individual strategies to kind of cope in the moment when experiencing a significant adversity like this. So some research has suggested three different types of coping strategies that has been shown to buffer the effects of experiencing racial discrimination in the moment, which is racial identity development, which is essentially promoting the sense of community and belonging to your racial identity group. And that has been shown to be a strong buffer against the effects of racial discrimination in the literature. Another one would be social support seeking, so implementing strategies to be able to contact those who are loved ones, friends, social support systems in place in those moments, help one regulate one regulate their negative emotions when experiencing an adversity like that. And then the third one being, it was on the tip of my tongue and I totally forgot. The third one being, an emotion regulation strategies in the moment. So where that would be cognitive strategies to kind of reframe the moment, emotion-focused strategies to kind of cope with negative mood states, as you can see in this paper, when one would potentially may experience this during tobacco withdrawal, and also, or problem-solving strategies in the moment to be able to, what can you do in those moments when you are experiencing those adversities? Unfortunately, it's, for me personally, as a clinician in training, it's unfortunate that we have to teach people individual strategies to cope when we can just target the greater problem, which is systemic racism. But those are some of the things in the literature that has been shown to be effective for those who experience high rates of discrimination.
It was very well said what you just said about how we can talk about certain treatments and that kind of thing, but it's also important to acknowledge the more systemic issues that are going on. So I was so eloquent. That was a beautiful answer.
Thank you.
So kind of, similarly, a question that came up is, what do you think are other implications for other fields, such as public health, policy, behavior science? How is kind of your data that you found, how's it going to influence other fields?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest one too is just public health in general and policies and interventions to address systemic racism, promoting more diversity in the workplaces, more diversity in any type of setting, and particularly to amplify the voices of underrepresented groups. I think as well, I think we as researchers need to do a better job, and I think we're doing a better job, as I said at the end of my presentation, to include the assessment of sociocultural factors that interplay with one's psychological states, because I think this is a new and upcoming field where we're really seeing how the environment, and particularly how these sociocultural stressors, may impact one's daily life and how they cope with stress, and also how they use substances to cope with a lot of distress. So I think those are the kind of the implications, is that including more assessment of these sociocultural and socio-environmental determinants that contribute to disparities in these groups, and also informing policies that address discrimination, particularly systemic racism, in our society.
As I mentioned, it's a very important topic. And then a natural question is, do you have any advice for those at USC who want to do work that's similar to yours on a topic that's similar in this field?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So for me, I'm a first-gen college student, and when I first started, before grad school, I had no idea what to do in terms of getting involved in research. I could tell you right now, 10 years ago, I would have never thought of myself as a researcher now. I'm really humble and grateful for my mentors. Find good mentors. Especially within the disparities field, there's so many people who are passionate about this type of work, and so excited, including myself. So if you are interested in doing this type of work, please feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you to other colleagues. Everyone is super friendly in this field because we all want to do good work. And so what I highly recommend is finding mentors, collaborators, to get started, to learn more about this field, because we're all really, really excited to continue promoting this type of work.
And I'll put your email in at the end. So I'm sure you'll be getting some questions and that kind of thing.
Love to.
So someone asked, can you talk about the ethical considerations in doing tobacco research like this? For example, in requiring participants to smoke at baseline?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And a lot of people have asked that as well. So that, so for the purposes of the study, this is the reason why we focused on non-treatment seeking smokers, because we were not giving any interventions, nor were we withholding any interventions from those who wanted to quit smoking. And if someone had a plan within the next 30 days to quit, what we do is we actually provide referrals and services. We wouldn't let them be involved in the study just for those ethical considerations, to kind of quit smoking resources so that they could sufficiently continue on with their plan to quit smoking. So that's why, for the purposes of the study, we had those who were still interested in continuing to smoke. We did inform them that at baseline, when they came in, that they smoked normally as they normally would. So we didn't ask them to smoke any more than they usually would, but we also informed them that they would stop smoking for 16 hours then the night before, and then also would have an opportunity to smoke later on in the session. Part of it is another part of the measure. So that's kind of the reason why ethically we did recruit those who were interested in quitting smoking, only just like a non-treatment seeking sample, a community sample.
So we have time, so this will be the last question. So you did publish this paper. Mm-hmm. So the question was about, how was the process of publishing? You kind of mentioned before that had a lot of collaboration, that kind of thing. But yeah, how was that process?
Oh, I love that question. It's interesting because I like to be completely frank. Disparity research is, I won't hold back. So disparity research is near and dear to my heart, and it's my entire passion. And it's also a very difficult field to publish in. So I remember, 5 years ago, or maybe 6 years ago, when I had my first publication in disparities, it was very, very difficult to get journals to publish important work looking at racial ethnic differences in withdrawal. And so I'm looking back now 5 years later, where I'm publishing this paper, and there's always a lot of revisions. It's always very difficult. For some reason, I think disparities papers get hit really hard. But after 2.5 years of working on this paper, I, finally seeing it full to publication, super proud and happy to see it finally get out there, because I think this is a really important work. And I think I will have to say it's because I wouldn't have stopped working on it if it weren't for the people, my mentors and colleagues who believed in me and believed in this type of work to kind of push me on and motivate me to keep fighting for this type of work, because it can be really difficult. I mean, it's hard to get funding, especially for disparities work. So I'm really glad this paper was able to get published.
It is very important work, and your passion is evident, like hearing you talk about your paper and your research, and just really awesome to see. Is there anything else you'd like to say that we have not yet addressed?
No, I mean, I hope that my biggest message is that we just continue to look at socio-environmental factors. Health disparities work is really incredibly important, especially with all of the racial injustices that have occurred just throughout all time, including this year. And so this work is really needed. Disparities continue to persist in COVID-19 pandemic and just in any type of public health problem. And so that's my biggest goal, is just to promote this type of work, because I hope that people continue doing this type of work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So we'll go ahead and close out. David, do you want to come back on for a moment while we close? Great. Well, thank you so much to both of our presenters. It's been a crazy year, and it's inspiring to learn more about the work that both of you are doing. If any audience members have any questions about either of the papers, feel free to email our presenters or email the writing competition email address. I'll go ahead and post this in the chat. So thank you again to everyone, and please have a healthy and joyful summer, everybody.